She laughed. Not a small laugh, not a polite laugh. The kind that fills a room, the kind that makes other people look up, the kind that says, "I am not embarrassed by this. I want you to hear it." My daughter, sitting across from me at her dining table, in the house I helped her buy, laughed at her father. I had just told her, quietly, that I didn't have much left, that the years had been what they had been, that things were simpler now than they used to be. I didn't say it for sympathy. I said it because she had asked, directly, about my finances, about the future, about what she might, as she put it, need to plan for. So I told her, simply, that she didn't need to worry, and she laughed. Her husband, Marcus, looked at the window. Her mother-in-law, who had been visiting for the weekend, made a small sound that was not quite a word, and I picked up my cup, drank the last of my tea, and said nothing. Because I knew something that none of them knew. I knew what was in the will. My name is Arthur Calloway. I am 71 years old, and the day my daughter laughed at me was the last day she ever would. Let me tell you who I am, because it matters enormously to this story, and because the version of me that existed in my daughter's mind and the version that actually existed were two entirely different people. In her mind, I was her retired father. Quiet, unremarkable, a man who wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation, who drove a 12-year-old car, who lived in a modest house on a modest street, and who had, as far as she could tell, lived a modest life. She was not entirely wrong about the cardigans, but she was wrong about everything else. My name before I retired was not simply Arthur Calloway. It was Arthur James Calloway, and for 33 years it appeared on the letterhead of Calloway and Associates, a private investment advisory firm that I built from a single room above a dry cleaner in 1981, with 2 clients, 1 telephone, and a complete absence of doubt that I was going to succeed. I did succeed, considerably. By 1995, 14 years in, we had 47 clients and a staff of 11. By 2005, we had institutional clients, a second office, and a reputation in certain circles that I was quietly proud of and publicly uninterested in discussing. I sold the firm in 2014. Quietly, the way I have always done significant things. The buyer was a larger advisory group that had been approaching me for 3 years, and the terms were satisfactory. I will not give you a number, because numbers in stories like this become the point, and the number is not the point. What is the point is that I had it, and no one in my family, with one exception, knew. The exception was my wife Dorothy. Dorothy knew everything. She always had. She was the only person in my life to whom I was fully legible, and I was grateful for that every single day of our 42 years together. Dorothy died 3 years ago. Peacefully, in her sleep, in the bedroom of the modest house on the modest street that we had lived in since 1979, and refused to leave, regardless of what we could have afforded instead. She always said, the house wasn't modest. The house was exactly the right size for the life we had chosen. She was right about most things. After Dorothy died, I updated my will. I had a will before that, of course. A responsible man with significant assets has a will. The previous version had been written when the children were young, when the assumptions were different, when I believed certain things about the people I was leaving things to. After Dorothy died, I spent 4 months watching my children, watching how they behaved now that there were no parents present to perform for, watching what they said and what they didn't say, and the small 10,000 ways people reveal who they actually are when they believe the audience has left. What I watched changed the will considerably. I have 3 children. Thomas, the eldest, 51 years old, a primary school teacher in a small town 4 hours from here. He has Dorothy's patience and my stubbornness, and a quality of genuine goodness that I have never taken for granted, because I have lived long enough to know it is rarer than it should be. Thomas called me every Sunday, not because I asked him to, because he wanted to. The calls lasted between 20 minutes and 2 hours, depending on what was happening in his week, and he always asked how I was before he told me how he was. He got that from his mother, James, the middle child, 48, lives in the same city as me, runs a small carpentry business that has never made him rich and never seemed to concern him. He comes over on Saturday mornings sometimes, brings pastries, fixes whatever is broken in the house without being asked, and leaves without making a production of the visit. He is the one who fixed the step on my porch 4 times in the last 2 years without mentioning it to anyone. I noticed. I always notice. And then Vivian, my daughter, 45 years old, the youngest, the one who laughed. I want to be fair to Vivian, because fairness requires effort in her case, and effort is important. She was not always this way. Or rather, the qualities she has now existed in smaller concentrations when she was younger, and something, marriage perhaps, or money, or the specific way that some people's worst qualities expand when they are never checked, had amplified them. She married Marcus 11 years ago. Marcus is successful. He works in finance. He has strong opinions about restaurants and stronger ones about people, and he wears his confidence the way some men wear expensive watches, to be seen rather than to tell the time. I have tried to find things to like about Marcus. I have not been entirely unsuccessful, but I have not been entirely successful either. In the 3 years since Dorothy died, Vivian's calls had become less frequent and more purposeful. Less, "How are you?" and more subtle inquiries about the house, the savings, the plan. She had begun, I noticed, referring to my home as that house, in a way that implied temporariness. As in, "Are you still managing that house on your own, Dad?" said with the specific warmth of someone who means something else entirely. I noted it. I noted the questions about the will. 3 separate occasions, each one framed differently, each one essentially the same question. What are you leaving, and to whom? I gave the same answer each time. Vague, reassuring, uninformative, and I watched. The dinner, the one where she laughed, was 8 months ago. She had invited me for Sunday lunch. Marcus was there. His mother Patricia was visiting for the weekend, a woman I have always found to be a reasonable person in unreasonable quantities. We ate, we talked. The conversation was the kind that exists on the surface of things. House renovations, holiday plans, something about a neighbor. And then, over dessert, Vivian set down her spoon and looked at me with the particular expression she has when she is about to say something she has prepared. She said, "Dad, Marcus and I have been talking about the future, about planning." I said, "What kind of planning?" She said, "Well, you're 71. The house is a lot for one person, and we were wondering what the situation is, financially, so we can be prepared." Be prepared. I looked at her, then at Marcus, then back at her. I said, "I appreciate the concern. Things are simple now. I don't have much. You don't need to worry about planning for anything significant." And she laughed. Full, unconcealed, aimed directly at me. She said to Marcus, not to me. "I told you." Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. Patricia looked at the table. I picked up my cup. I drank the last of my tea. I set it down without sound. I did not say anything, because there are moments when silence is not weakness. When silence is the most precise response available, when what you do not say carries more weight than anything you could. I knew what was in the will. She did not. Let me tell you about the will. Not the final version, the one that would be read, but how it came to be what it was. Because the will was not a reaction. It was not written in anger or in the immediate aftermath of hurt feelings. It was written over 4 months with my solicitor, a careful woman named Helen Marsh, who has handled my legal affairs for 19 years and who received my instructions with the professional composure of someone who has seen most things and who said, only once, "Arthur, are you certain?" I said, "Helen, have I ever asked you to do something I wasn't certain of?" She said, "No." I said, "Then let's proceed." The will had several components. The house, the modest house on the modest street, went to Thomas, not because he needed it most, but because he was the one who had driven 4 hours, 3 separate times in the year after Dorothy died, to sit with me in it without any particular agenda. Just to be present, in the way that some people know how to be present, without needing it to mean something transactional. The house goes to the person who understood what it was. To James, I left the contents of a specific account and something more personal. Dorothy's father had left her a workshop full of tools, beautiful old tools, the kind made in an era when things were built to last. And James, who builds things with his hands and understands what good tools mean, was the right person for them. Plus the account, which was sufficient to expand his business if he chose to, or simply to have security that he had never had and never complained about not having. He would not be expecting either. There were charitable provisions. Dorothy and I had discussed these for years. 3 organizations, ones we had quietly supported throughout our marriage, received significant portions. This was not new. This had been our intention for a long time. And then, Vivian. I will tell you what Vivian received. She received a letter, written by me, 2 pages, in my handwriting, placed inside a sealed envelope marked with her name, to be opened after the will was read. The letter said what I had not been able to say at the dinner table when she laughed, what I had not said on any of the occasions she had asked about the finances, what I had carried, quietly, for 3 years. It was not an angry letter. That is the most important thing about it. It was not written from pain, or bitterness, or the desire to wound. It was written from something quieter and more durable than any of those things. It was written from clarity. Helen had asked me, when we finalized everything, "How do you feel?" I said, "Honest." She said, "That's a good way to feel about a will." I said, "It's a good way to feel about most things." Between the dinner and the reading of the will, 8 months passed. I want to tell you about those 8 months, because they were not inactive months. They were not months of waiting or of rehearsing what was coming, or of nursing what had happened at that table. They were genuinely some of the better months I have had in recent years. Thomas came to visit in February. He stayed for a week. We cooked together, which we had done since he was a boy, Dorothy's influence, and we walked in the mornings and talked in the evenings, and on the last night he was there. We sat in the kitchen long after we should have gone to bed, and he told me things about his life, real things, the kind that people only tell you when they trust you completely. I stored all of it, carefully, in the place I keep the things I want to keep. James came by on Saturdays, as he always did. He rebuilt the back fence in April, which had been listing since the previous autumn. I offered to pay him. He said, "Dad, stop." I stopped. Vivian called twice in those 8 months. Both calls were brief. Both had the particular quality of calls made from obligation rather than desire. She asked if I was well. I said yes. She mentioned Marcus was busy. I said I understood. She did not ask about the will again. I think she believed, after the dinner, that the question had been answered. That her father had confirmed what she had suspected, that there was not much, and that planning for something significant was unnecessary. I did not correct this impression. In June, I had a health scare. Chest pains, which turned out to be nothing serious, a combination of dehydration and the particular anxiety that arrives, sometimes at 71, without much warning. I spent 2 nights in hospital for observation. Thomas drove 4 hours when I called him. He was there within the day. James was at the hospital before I had finished checking in, because the hospital was 12 minutes from his workshop, and he had dropped everything without being asked. Vivian sent a text. "Hope you feel better soon, Dad. Marcus and I are in Tuscany until the 14th. Let me know if anything serious." I read that text, lying in a hospital bed, with Thomas on one side and James on the other, and I felt, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of settling. The settling of someone who has been uncertain about a decision and is suddenly not uncertain anymore. I was discharged 2 days later. Thomas drove me home. James had stocked the kitchen while we were at the hospital, quietly, without mentioning it, in the specific way he does things. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen of the house that was exactly the right size for the life we had chosen, and I looked at the stocked shelves and the rebuilt fence visible through the window, and I thought about Dorothy. She always said, "Arthur, people show you who they are, in the small moments, not the big ones. Anyone can show up for the big ones. Watch what they do on a Tuesday afternoon, when nothing is at stake." I had been watching Tuesdays for 3 years. The will was already written. Dorothy would have approved. My health, as it turned out, did not improve as consistently as the doctors had initially hoped. By September, 3 months after the hospital stay, it was clear that my heart, which had worked reliably for 71 years, was beginning to require more attention than I had been giving it. Not an emergency, not immediately serious, but a direction of travel that I understood clearly enough to act on. I called Helen. I said, "Let's make sure everything is in order." She said, "Everything is in order." I said, "Good." I called Thomas and James separately and told them the health situation honestly, the way I have always told them things, without drama and without minimizing. Thomas was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then he said, "I'm coming down next weekend." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." James came over that same evening, sat in the kitchen, didn't say much, stayed 3 hours. I called Vivian. She said, "Oh, Dad, well, you need to be sensible about this. Have you thought about? We've talked about this. The house might really be too much now. Marcus and I could help you look at some options." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "And the financial side. Should we sit down and make sure everything is organized?" I said, "Everything is organized." She said, "Right. Good." A pause. "Let me know if you need anything." She hung up before I could respond. The reading of the will took place on a Thursday morning in November. Helen's office. A room I had been in many times over 19 years. A room that smelled of old paper and good furniture polish and the specific quality of a place where important things happen regularly. Thomas arrived first. He hugged me at the door, the way he always does, properly, with both arms. He looked tired from the drive. James was already there when we came in, sitting in one of the chairs, turning his hat in his hands, the way he does when he's nervous. Vivian arrived with Marcus. She was dressed carefully. Marcus was dressed carefully. They had the particular quality of people who have prepared for a specific outcome and dressed for it. She hugged me briefly. Said, "How are you feeling, Dad?" Not quite a question. I said, "Clear-headed." She nodded and took her seat. Helen came in. She greeted everyone. She sat down. She placed the document on the table. The room went quiet. Helen reads wills the way she does everything. Precisely, without emphasis, allowing the words to carry their own weight. She began with the preamble. Standard language, the kind that establishes who the document is about and what it intends. I watched the room while she read. Thomas had his hands folded in his lap, looking at the table. Not with expectation, with the slightly braced quality of someone who is prepared to receive news of any kind. James was still turning his hat, slower now. Vivian was very still. Marcus had his arms crossed, both of them with the forward quality of people listening for a specific thing. Helen reached the charitable provisions. She read the 3 organizations, the amounts beside them. The amounts were significant. I saw Vivian's expression shift, just slightly, at the first number, a recalibration. The first indication that the picture she had carried into this room was not the picture being described. Helen continued. The provision for Thomas, the house, described in full legal terms, which nevertheless left no ambiguity about what it was and what it was worth. Thomas looked up. He looked at me. I gave him the smallest nod. His jaw moved. He looked back at the table. He did not make a sound. The provision for James. The account. The tools. Helen read the description of the account value with the same flat precision she brought to everything. James stopped turning his hat. He looked at me, and he had the expression of a man who is trying very hard to maintain composure in a professional setting and is not entirely succeeding. I looked at him for a moment. He nodded once. I nodded back. Helen paused. She turned a page. She said, "The provision pertaining to Vivian Catherine Calloway Hart." The room shifted. Vivian straightened. Marcus uncrossed and recrossed his arms. Helen read, "To my daughter Vivian, I leave the contents of the sealed envelope marked with her name to be opened privately following this reading. No financial provision is made within this document, as the reasons for this decision are fully articulated within the letter contained therein." Vivian said. "I'm sorry?" Helen said. "The provision for you is a letter, Mrs. Hart." "To be opened privately," Marcus said. "That's it?" Helen said. "That is the provision as written." "Yes." Vivian looked at me. I looked back at her. I did not look away. She said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "It's what the letter says." She said, "You can't. Dad, I'm your daughter." I said, "I know you are. That is why I wrote you a letter instead of nothing." Marcus stood up. He said something about legal challenges, about capacity, about procedures. Helen addressed each point in the same flat, precise tone she uses for everything, and each point was addressed and closed because the will was correctly executed, witnessed, and beyond challenge. I had made sure of that. Thomas and James said nothing during this. Thomas had his hands folded. James was looking at his hat. After Marcus finished, and Helen had finished responding, the room was very quiet. Helen placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of Vivian. White. Her name on the front. My handwriting. Vivian looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, and she left. I will tell you what the letter said, not word for word, because some of it belongs to her and to me, and to the specific privacy of a father writing to his daughter about things that have accumulated over years. But the shape of it, the intention. It began, "Dear Vivian," not "Dear Viv," which is what I have called her since she was 3 years old. Dear Vivian, because the letter was not from her father in the casual daily sense. It was from her father in the fullest sense, and that required her full name. I told her about the company, about Calloway and Associates, about 33 years of building something, about the sale, about the fact that the man she had laughed at, the man she had assumed, had nothing worth planning for, had made careful and significant decisions over a lifetime that she had never asked about, because she had assumed the answer before she asked. I did not say this to wound her. I said it because she deserved to know what she had laughed at. I told her about Dorothy, about the 4 months after her mother died, when I watched my children, and what I saw. I told her about Thomas driving 4 hours 3 times with no agenda, about James and the fence and the porch step and the stocked kitchen, about her 2 calls in 8 months, and the text from Tuscany. I told her that money is not something I have ever valued for its own sake, that Dorothy and I lived in the modest house on the modest street because it was the right size for the life we chose, not because we had no other option. That the cardigans and the 12-year-old car were choices, not circumstances. I told her that what I was leaving to Thomas and James was not a reward. That I do not believe in rewarding people for being decent, because decency should not require a prize. What I was leaving them was an expression of who they were, reflected back in the only language a will has available. And I told her, what I was not leaving her was not a punishment either. It was, in its own way, the same kind of reflection. I told her that the door was not closed, that she was my daughter, that she had been my daughter since the morning she was born, which was the best morning of a year that contained many good mornings, and that nothing, no decision, no will, no letter, changed what she was to me in the most fundamental sense. But that fundamental sense, I told her, works in both directions. She was my daughter, and I was her father, not a resource, not a financial situation to plan around, not a problem to manage. Her father. The letter ended. I have loved you since the morning you were born. I love you now. What love requires of both of us is something I hope you will think about, in the quiet, after today. Your father, Arthur, Thomas and James and I went for lunch after the reading. A place nearby, nothing special. The kind of restaurant that has been in the same location for 20 years and succeeded entirely on the quality of the food rather than the decor. We sat for 2 hours. Thomas asked me, at some point during the first hour, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us about the company, about what you had built?" I said, "Would it have changed anything?" He thought about it. He said, "For us? No, I don't think so." I said, "Then it didn't need saying." James said, without looking up from his food, "Did Mum know?" I said, "Your mother knew everything." He smiled at that. The smile of someone who is not surprised. Thomas said, "The house, Dad." "I can't. That's your home." I said, "It was our home. Now it will be yours. And eventually, maybe your children's. A house that has been lived in properly should keep being lived in properly." He said, "I'll take care of it." I said, "I know you will. Vivian called me that evening." 8:30. I was in the kitchen. The same kitchen. The same quiet. I answered. She said, "Dad." I said, "Vivian." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I read the letter." I said, "I know." She said, I didn't know about the company, about any of it." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Would it have changed how you behaved?" She didn't answer immediately. And the fact that she didn't answer immediately was the most honest thing she had said to me in a long time. She said, "I don't know." I said, "That's an honest answer." She said, "I laughed at you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I know you are." She said, What happens now?" I said, "Now you decide what kind of daughter you want to be. To a father who is 71 and has a heart that requires attention and who has, despite everything, never stopped being your father." I said, "The will is the will. That doesn't change. But the letter said, 'The door is not closed.'" She said, "Is it really not?" I said, "Vivienne, you are my daughter. The door is, and always will be, open." I said, "What you do with that is up to you." That was 8 months ago. My health, with the attention it now receives and the adjustments I have made, is stable. The doctors are cautiously satisfied, which at 71 I have decided to receive as the excellent news it is. Thomas calls every Sunday. He has already been down twice to look at the house properly, not to take possession, but to understand it, to walk through it, with the attention of someone who intends to honor what it has been. He found the mark on the kitchen doorframe, where Dorothy used to measure the children's heights every birthday, and he called me that evening, specifically to tell me he had found it, and that it would stay. I could not speak for a moment when he told me that. James expanded the workshop, hired 2 people. He called me last month to tell me about a commission, a piece of furniture for a museum, and the pride in his voice was the specific pride of someone who has been given the room to become more fully what they already were. That is what I wanted for him. Vivian. She came to the house in January, alone, without Marcus. She called ahead and asked if she could come, which she had not done before. She had always simply arrived, and the asking itself was something. She came in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She said, "I've been thinking about the letter, about what you said, about Mum." I said, "What about her?" She said, "You said she showed you who she was in small moments, and that you watched us the same way." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't like what I showed you." I said, "No." She said, "Can I? Is it possible to show you something different?" I said, "Vivian, I am 71 years old. I have more Tuesdays behind me than ahead of me, but the ones that are ahead of me are still Tuesdays, and I am still watching," she said. "Then I'll show you." She has come back 3 times since January. Each time a little easier, each time a little more like the daughter she was before whatever accumulation of things made her into someone who could laugh at her father began. I do not know how the story ends. No one does. That is not weakness. That is just the nature of stories that are still being written. But she is coming on Sunday. I bought the pastries James usually brings, because James told me she liked them when they were children and had never stopped. Small things. Tuesday afternoons when nothing is at stake. Dorothy would know what to do with that. She always did. My wife used to say that a will is not really about money. She said, a will is the last conversation, the one where you finally say, clearly, without interruption, what you actually thought of the people you loved, what they meant to you, what you needed from them, and whether they gave it. I did not plan for my daughter to laugh at me. I did not plan for the dinner, or the text from Tuscany, or the 2 calls in 8 months. But I had planned the will, carefully, stamps, honestly, over 4 months, with a solicitor who asked me once if I was certain, and to whom I said, yes. Not because I wanted to wound anyone, because a will, as Dorothy said, is the last conversation. And I had things to say. To Thomas, who drove 4 hours because someone needed him to booked, I said, here is the house. Take care of it the way you took care of me. To James, who fixed the step on my porch 4 times without mentioning it, I said, here is the room to build, because you deserved it long before I could give it. And to Vivian, I said, here is a letter, and here is the truth, and here is a door that is open, because you are my daughter, and that has never, and will never, be nothing. If you have someone in your life who shows up on the Tuesdays When nothing is at stake, tell them. Not with a will. Now. While you can. The last conversation is better when it isn't the last one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me about someone who shows up for your Tuesdays. I'll see you in the next one.